So I've already expressed how it is I'd like the MCU to be from a cinematographical standpoint, but what would I actually like to see happen in an MCU that kept those cinematographics? What stories would I want to see? What characters would I like to see debut? What are things I want changed? Well, let's just get right into it. Number 1. Ant-Man. I would have wanted this film to be part of the Phase 1 slate as it was originally intended to be, with it probably releasing sometime between The Incredible Hulk and the First Avenger alongside Iron Man 2 and Thor. Instead of centering around Scott Lang and Hope Van Dyne with side characters like Cassie and Scott's criminal friends, I would want Ant-Man to follow a prime Hank Pym and Janet, where the movie is set within the present day alongside the rest of the MCU cast as opposed to the 60s, as we follow Hank's origin into the titular character. The main villain would not be Darren Cross as Yellow Jacket, but someone else. One possible candidate is Egghead, although he's not my definitive choice. Out of all the original Ant-Man villains, he just seems like the most fitting for the grounded direction. And they did use him in Ant-Man and the Wasp, so it's possible he might have been chosen anyway had Hank been the lead. The movie itself I could still see being somewhat of a heist movie, however not as comedic. Number 2, The First Avenger. Now, of course, this movie is one of the original 5 and not in the same camp as the post-2011 films, but as I've expressed in my tier list video, this movie's cinematics does admittedly feel pretty significantly removed from its 4 predecessors to its own degree, so I wanted to include this as well. Aside from having the film be cinematically closer to the previous 4, I don't have much to say in the way of the story, which I like. However, thematically, I wish this movie had leaned more into actual war movie territory. I would have liked for it to center more on World War II and the aspects of war as a whole, while we actually get to see Steve on the battlefield fighting Hydra units alongside other soldiers and the Howling Commandos, going through trenches and other militaristic settings. Basically, what they reduced to just a quick montage sequence I instead wish was a good chunk of the movie. I would have loved to see something like that for a Captain America origin film on top of what was already presented. Additionally, I would want the appearance of Red Skull's head to be tweaked to look slightly more like burnt skin, while he himself is more of an intimidating figure and less like a standard comic book villain. Number 3, Avengers. With Ant-Man being part of this Phase 1 slate, I imagine him and Janet becoming part of the original team like in the comics. This is where Janet would first debut in the Wasp suit. As such, Nat and Clint's roles I think should be reduced so as to not overcrowd the film. Instead of being part of the initiative, they would merely assist the Avengers alongside S.H.I.E.L.D. and not become official members until later down the line. As far as the film itself, I would have liked for it to be longer and a bit slower paced. Actually, properly incorporating each of the solo film's events, rather than things such as Thor returning to Earth or Steve's adjustment to the modern world being reduced to flashbacks, throwaway lines, or omitted scenes entirely. Those things would actually be shown and given their time. So for instance, instead of Thor just suddenly showing up during a storm to take Loki, there would be an entire sequence prior to that where we return to Asgard and briefly follow up on Thor's whereabouts before Odin calls for him and directly sends him back to Earth in wake of the Rainbow Bridge being destroyed. For Norton, I would have liked his Hulk to have a much more significant role in this movie and serve as the penultimate antagonist of sorts. Instead of having a brief scuffle with Thor on the helicarrier, there would be an entire sequence where all of the Avengers battle him upon his release, serving as a pivotal moment of the second act. It would be very much like the fight scene in the Ultimate Avengers animated movie, with Liv Tyler's Betty arriving in the end just the same. Not only do I just think it would be fitting for Norton's version of the character, and in line with his depiction in The Incredible Hulk, but as a bonus, it would also pay homage to how Hulk was the reason they all came together in the original comic. Lastly, I would have preferred if all of the original composers from the solo films had returned to score scenes for each individual character, further blending all of the original film's vibes, alongside a new composer who would of course not be Alan Silvestri. Number 4, Iron Man 3. Rather than Aldrich Killian, I would have loved to see Ben Kingsley be the real Mandarin. with his iteration being the true main villain of the film. It would actually focus on the Ten Rings organization instead of AIM and Extremis, and expand upon Tony's conflict with them as he finally comes into confrontation with their boss, who's had his eye on him since the first movie. And while I don't have much of a problem with him by himself, I wouldn't include Harley in it either. I'd want it to just focus on Tony and co like the first and second films. Number 5. Dark World. One thing I wish this film did was explore the Rainbow Bridge being restored. One thing I realized that was glossed over was the bridge just suddenly being fixed without any explanation, despite how pivotal of a moment Thor destroying it was in the first film. Apparently this was resolved in a tie-in comic, which I just learned, but I would have preferred that to have been a focus somewhere within the film itself, so the beginning of the movie wouldn't just jump straight into a battle on Vanaheim. For the final battle, instead of Thor and Jane using a makeshift teleportation device to defeat Malekith, I would have liked for Thor and him to have a one-on-one battle off-world, where Thor summons lightning from all 9 realms to strike Malekith down, as was conceived in early drafts for the film. Additionally, I would have liked Malekith's concept art design to be kept, as well as some of his original demeanor. Number 6. Incredible Hulk 2. The main antagonist of the film would once again be General Ross, this time in the form of Red Hulk, as was in the original plans. Stearns would serve as a secondary antagonist of sorts, having further mutated since the ending of the first movie and being the mastermind behind the film's events, but he would not yet be fully revealed. We'd also get to see Ross's rise in government position and how exactly he went from general to secretary. It would basically involve much of the elements that Brave New World took, only with actual Hulk characters. The film would be part of the Phase 2 slate alongside the other sequels. Number 7. Black Widow. I would have liked to have seen Natasha get her own solo movie long before Infinity War. The film would take place after Winter Soldier as another edition of Phase 2, and part of it would involve her going back to Russia and delving into her past, including of course her history with the Red Room and her admission into S.H.I.E.L.D., something that was alluded to in a deleted scene in Civil War. Obviously there would be no Yelena or Red Guardian or any of that, and it would just focus on Natasha. Although some other characters that could have a part in it would be Clint and Fury, with the film also potentially diving into her relationship with Clint. Number 8. Guardians. Ever since learning about what the Guardians were like before Gunn's version and what was changed, I definitely would have liked to have seen the original versions of the characters adapted, rather than making them a ragtag group of misfits, with Quill specifically being the more dutiful, interplanetary officer-type character, rather than a spunky wanted criminal. An extra member of the team that I would like to see added also is Quasar. The only thing I can say in the way of the story is that I would have liked to have seen just a little more of Quill's early life on Earth as a kid before jumping forward to him in space. So instead of starting off with a hospital scene, we would see some earlier bits of his childhood, and then end it off with his mom's passing. Though I also wouldn't have him be immediately abducted upon running out of the hospital. I would wait some time after and let the moment breathe before he's then taken into space somehow. I don't mind Yondu and the Ravagers still being involved in his backstory. Number 9. Age of Ultron. Instead of Tony and Bruce creating Ultron, I would have liked if, of course, it was Hank who started the Ultron project, with Tony instead taking Bruce's position and merely assisting Hank. Rather than a vision, the creation of Ultron would instead be a direct follow-up of the events of Ant-Man 2, which I would have take place before this movie, as it would serve as a good segue into this storyline. The film would instead start off with Hank, rather than the entire team infiltrating a Hydra base. Due to the events of Iron Man 3, Tony would not immediately be back as Iron Man. His return in the armor would be more of a pivotal grand return moment in the movie, where we don't see him don a new suit until sometime in the beginning of the second act once he learns the threat that Ultron poses. I also would not include Wanda and Pietro in this version of the MCU, and the movie would focus solely on the already existing cast. Bruce and Nat would obviously not have a romantic relationship, and instead, I could see Betty still making a small appearance. Due to the events of Winter Soldier, Fury would not return as director in this movie, and S.H.I.E.L.D. would not appear in the end, instead being replaced largely by a more militaristic presence given the scope of the situation. Ultron himself would of course be much more cold and robotic, very much like his past iterations. Lastly, Hulk would not fly off to space in the end, but would remain on Earth. Number 10. Spider-Man. This movie would replace Ant-Man as the final film of Phase 2. This version of Spider-Man would be much more in line with its other live-action iterations, and would be somewhat of a mix between Andrew's Spider-Man and Tobey's Spider-Man. There would be no Ned Leeds, no Michelle Jones, no Liz, no Teen Betty, and Flash would still be the jock-type character, and of course no Tony or Avengers. I don't mind, however, Aunt May being younger. Peter would once again be accompanied by MJ and Harry, with the movie being self-contained and solely focusing on Peter's world. Just the same, the movie would not dive into Peter's origins, but start off 6 months after he's already become Spider-Man. However, Uncle Ben's accident would be directly referenced and called back to a lot more. Vulture is still the main villain, but his motivations would be tweaked upon the omission of Tony and Liz. For the record, the movie would not be called The Spider-Man. I just wouldn't want it to be called Spider-Man Homecoming. The subtitle would be different and would not be home-themed. Number 11. Madbomb. Replacing Civil War, Cap 3 would be Madbomb as it was originally supposed to be, continuing the Winter Soldier storyline and keeping in line with the groundedness and political intrigue of Winter Soldier itself. As such, this is where Zemo would debut as the main villain. Here his origins and motivation would be changed as a result. Rather than the Ultron incident leading into a revenge scheme against the Avengers, his conflict would of course be more closely tied to Steve, in which case I would tweak his origin to be slightly closer to his comic counterpart. It would be revealed that his grandfather was a top scientist in Red Skull's regime, and it could be that perhaps his death during Steve's operations in World War II somehow led to a major tragedy in his whole family line, thus leading into his plans for revenge, which he would use the Madbomb in order to achieve. Another villain I'd like to see return is Zola, who I wouldn't have killed off in Winter Soldier. He would have a much more prominent role, perhaps forming an alliance with Zemo, and being a key element to the detonation of the Madbomb. Maybe he could even be the creator of the bomb itself. This could also be the movie where Fury finally returns as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Number 12. Hulk 3. Bruce stays on Earth after Ultron so that he can have his final movie in the trilogy where he finally faces off against Stearns, aka the leader directly, who is the main villain of this movie, and finally revealed in his complete mutated form. The whole movie follows the conflict between Bruce and Stearns, as Stearns' main goal is centered around trying to harness Hulk's power and delve into its true nature. By the end, Hulk defeats Stearns, and the events of the film lead Bruce to go back into hiding, becoming absent from the movies going forward with no one knowing his whereabouts. A sort of poetic ending to the trilogy as he ultimately ends up back where he started in the first movie, only this time a choice of his own accord. Number 13. Civil War. Instead of being a Captain America movie, Civil War would serve as the third Avengers film, focusing a lot more on the conflict of the Sokovia Accords and the interpersonal conflicts between each of the characters rather than just Steve and Bucky. Peter would have a little more of a significant role, appearing in more scenes and being more closely tied to the conflict himself. Tony would still be the one to recruit him, but there would be less of a mentor-rookie dynamic between them, with Peter largely doing his own thing. I could possibly see Zemo returning as the one to ultimately pit the cast against each other, but I could also see there being no villain at all, and the movie focusing solely on the conflict between the cast and the government. I think Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. should also have some kind of presence in this movie. It was odd that they had no appearance at all, despite Fury being the one who started the Avengers initiative in the first place, in which you'd think he'd have some sort of opposition. Number 14. Spider-Man 2. Like the first movie, This movie would be self-contained and would not involve Fury, Happy, S.H.I.E.L.D., or the Avengers. Beck himself wouldn't be a former Stark employee. His background as a former stuntman and VFX artist would be kept, and instead his conflict with Peter would be much more personal, with their confrontation being brought about through some other means. He would not find out Peter's identity in this movie. Instead, the movie would end with him simply framing Spider-Man himself as a murderer before he's ultimately taken down, leaving Peter to deal with the ramifications of his action. Also, Aunt May would not have found out Peter's identity. Number 15. Ragnarok. I quite like much of the story that Ragnarok was going for, and feel it would have made for a very good third Thor movie under different circumstances. However, there are, of course, a few things I'd tweak about it. Fandral and Volstagg, for one, would not be killed off so quickly and so early in the film. Instead, both of them, as well as Hogun and Sif, would once again have supporting roles within the story, same as the previous films, being the ones to help defend Asgard as Thor and Loki are whisked away to Sakaar. Korg can still have a role as one of the contenders Thor allies himself with, but of course his character would have to be radically changed. Same with the Grand Master, who would not be played by Jeff Goldblum. Sakaar itself would be much more gladiator-like in its appearance. Whether or not Jane, Selvig, and Darcy would have roles in this movie, I'm not sure, but Jane, for one, would not be broken up with Thor. Or at least it would not be something that's just randomly dropped in as a throwaway line and brushed off. That's something that I would actually show within the movie as an important scene, be it a flashback or a real-time scene. Number 16. Spider-Man 3. The third film would follow Peter as he tries to clear his name while simultaneously dealing with the consequences of said framing. The main villain of the film would be Kraven, who is out to hunt him after his outing as an alleged murderer. Also after Peter, alongside him would be Mac Gargan, aka Scorpion, who's broken out of prison and seeks revenge against him after the first movie, obtaining his own suit. Aiding Peter in this film would be Charlie Cox's Daredevil, who would appear both as Matt Murdock and in the suit, helping to clear Spider-Man's name. Spider-Man and Kraven's conflict would ultimately lead to the death of Aunt May, serving as Peter's final major challenge in the trilogy. It's also where he would finally reveal his identity to her, similar to the PS4 game. The film would end with him once again proving himself to the public as a hero and starting his life anew. Number 17 and 18. Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2. Rather than both of the films having two separate titles, I would keep the films as being named Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2. Thanos would retain his design and warlord-like demeanor from Guardians and Ultron, and his goal would not be centered around resources and balancing the universe. It would not be the Lady Death storyline either, but it would be something more related to that, with Thanos' goals overall being much more sadistic and dictator-like in nature rather than humanitarian. The other would also still be alive and serve as another aid to Thanos alongside the Black Order. This would also be the movie where the Sokovia Accords are finally repealed in light of the situation. Part 2 would not center on time travel. The stones would instead not be destroyed, and the movie would focus on a different means as to reviving life and defeating Thanos. The key element to this alternative solution would be Adam Warlock, who I would have introduced in Guardians 2, before becoming a crucial character in this film as the one who ultimately leads the cast to victory against Thanos. Hank could still play a crucial role as well, where the Pym particles could aid in another way. The movie would still end with a gigantic battle of all the MCU's heroes and other beings facing off against Thanos and his army before Thanos is ultimately snapped away. Now, I don't know if Tony would still be the one to snap, or what Steve's new conclusion would be given the omission of the time travel element. But either way, this film would still see the end of these two characters, whether they both die, one dies and the other retires, or they both retire. Additionally, there would also be no Professor Hulk. Banner and Hulk would still be the same, with the two developing in another way after all their time spent in isolation. There would be a brief scene during the final battle where Bruce unleashes Hulk one last time to battle Thanos, similarly to Wanda's scene in the original film. Number 19, Cap 4. Now, I personally would have liked for the MCU to have ended after Infinity War, serving as the finale of the franchise. I would not go on into the multiverse saga, Kang, Doom, or any of that. However, there are just a few Phase 4 movies that I would still keep to merely serve as epilogue films that explore the state of the world after the snap and the entire events of Infinity War overall. The first of which would be Cap 4, exploring the state of Earth respectively. Rather than Sam, Cap 4 would follow Bucky as he takes up the mantle of Captain America. The movie would act as a redemption story as Bucky tries to move on from the Winter Soldier persona. It would follow his struggles as he tries to live up to his best friend, but is continuously hindered by the weight of his immense guilt and traumatic past, failing to be the proper symbol that people see Captain America to be. The main villains of the film would be the Serpent Society, although I could also see the Flag Smashers still taking the role as well. The end of the film would see Bucky ultimately taking the mantle and making it his own, embracing being a completely different Captain America that's not anything like Steve, as he sets himself on a path to a brighter future. And finally, number 20, Thor 4. Jane would not become Mighty Thor in this movie. Taking her place would be Beta Ray Bill, who I would introduce in this movie. The movie itself would solely focus on Thor versus Gorr, as Jane gets entangled in the conflict for some other reason while slowly battling her illness. Gorr's design would be closer to his comic appearance, and the movie at no point would involve kids as a centerpiece. Rather than Thor imbuing a bunch of children with his power, it's Beta Ray Bill who receives the power in the end, as Stormbreaker is passed down to him. The movie would end with a battle between Thor and Beta Ray Bill, teaming up against Gorr, with the two ultimately coming out on top. There is no love. The movie simply ends with Jane's passing, as Thor's own story concludes in another way. This movie would serve as the true ending of the MCU, as there would be no more movies beyond this point. And there you have it. That's the MCU I would have loved to have seen had the franchise kept its grounded origins. I couldn't get into every single movie and show, but those are most of the specific changes that I had in my head that I wanted to go over. I'll put some additional details in my comment below. Until then.